nothing that's identifiable. And I would encourage you, if you have clinical examples or clinical questions, to make sure that everything is disguised. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our, well, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, but I do want to say that we have a great team here. I think after our first meeting, I think it was Karen who sort of joked that both she and Nicole like to talk. And while that may be true, they both like to talk, but they also both have a great deal to say. And I think that you'll learn a lot from both of them. Our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Nicole Tefera. She is a pediatric psychologist at Advocate Children's Hospital Behavioral Health Services, which serves the southwest and suburban areas of Chicago. Dr. Tefera is an affiliate of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and her clinical interests and expertise center on helping underserved and minority populations cope with trauma. She's going to speak to you. I've titled for her part of this talk, The New World of in COVID. Nicole, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As I was preparing for the talk today, one of the things that I noticed was, how do I spend 20 minutes talking about the new world or new beginnings? And so I think in an effort to really parse down my talk and save opportunities for discussion and questions, I came across 3 points that I really wanted to highlight to you today. The one point, and often this has to do with me pulling from my work at Advocate and also my supervision of clinical trainees and the themes that I see emerging and the parallels that I see emerging between my own work as a professional, clinical trainees' work, and the child and adolescent experience. So the first point that I really want to highlight is that there are many parallels to what we are going through as professionals that are delivering services, and also what the client population that we serve are dealing with. And so just really taking that apart and being able to draw the parallels and identify, well, what is it that we're all having to adjust to as we think about new beginnings? And the biggest piece that I think has challenged many of us has to do with adjusting to the virtual world. I know that when the pandemic first hit, there was not a lot of preparation, particularly for the training community, as well as children and teenagers and college students, as it related to how do we keep this going, whether it's therapeutic services or academic support. And so we did the best that we could, right, to get through that time period, and spent the summer adjusting and such. And so with that being said, once students academically had news from their schools that they weren't necessarily returning, it became more of this longstanding chronic adjustment of having to start a new semester, so to speak. So for the clinical trainees experience of starting a new semester in school and also navigating that with starting a new clinical internship experience, and the parallels between that and for the child adolescent client, them starting remotely in a sense where some are going in person, but for the majority of students, they have returned back to school remotely. And so when I speak to that, I speak speak to what has it been like for interns who are restarting their academic studies, restarting new internships, and then also holding their clients who are restarting a brand new school year virtually. And so I think that's the huge stressor, and also opportunity for innovation and resiliency to show up. But some of the challenges I'll speak to really have to do with how does this modality of being in the land of Zoom, how does that truly affect one's ability to socialize, engage in activities that were just part of their daily way of being, and be able to just have space in their day, whether it's a client that we're working with or whether it's an actual intern or therapist. How do they create space for breaks that were just naturally a part of their day? In the virtual world, I have reflected upon and noticed that there's lots of less opportunities for taking breaks, slowing down, and in those breaks having opportunity for building relationships or socializing, or just getting the necessary rest that one needs. So as I think about some of the stressors, I think about it from the perspective of we're kind of all going through this at the same time, yet in our professional capacity, our role is to be present and be available for our clients. And so how do we do that given our own challenges that we're dealing with? And so that brings me to my second point, and that really is to highlight what supports are available to therapists to trainees, as well as what are the supports for the clients that we are seeing. And so in terms of the clinical trainee, I think about what has been the support that they've received from at their own family level, at their academic program level, at their clinical supervision level. Has this pandemic made it difficult for them to formulate a training cohort in a way that has traditionally served as a supportive relationship for the clinical trainee's experience? Similarly, for the child and adolescent clients that we're seeing, what has their support system been like, or how has their support system been impacted? Whether it's parents who are trying to also find their way of coping and having to work at home, or having to go out to work and finding childcare for children that are left home to participate in school. So what has the child and adolescence support system, how has that changed in the midst of the new beginnings? How have the ways in which they gain support or garner support from their teachers and other paraprofessionals within their academic settings, how has that been impacted? And how has their support from their own therapists been impacted as a result of ongoing pandemic? So when I think about the parallel process and what is needed for interns to be able to support their clients in meaningful and helpful ways, I really think about how do we support as professionals, as supervisors, as academic institutions, how do we support the individual interns' clinical training experiences as we continue to move forward through the pandemic. So a lot of, the first point that I've made and the second point that I've made have to do with truly just reflecting upon the situations that we find ourselves in and what the challenges are associated with the place that we find ourselves in. So as I move into the third point, I really kind of move into more of a action stance, which is like, okay, so then what do we do about this? What have you found that's been helpful? And what is needed? And so we have spent some time in preparation for this talk today, really just kind of hearing from other people that have been engaged in training and supporting interns as to what's been helpful and what has worked, in addition to our own experiences as supervisors as to what has worked. So oftentimes in the midst of crises or just ambiguity or times of uncertainty, really my general rule of thumb and what I can offer is really being able to help identify what's within our control, what's within your control, and what is outside of your control, and how to be able to identify particular ways of creative ways, innovative ways of bolstering what is within our control in an effort to buffer some of the negative consequences associated with what I've talked about previously of living in a virtual world. So some things that I've reflected on and talked about with my own trainees and have read about in various different training editorials is really being able to kind of hone in now more than ever on what is the training experience going to look like this year, and how do we establish a foundation of the training experience that is rooted in the intern's goals. What are my goals for this year, given that most of my time may be spent off-site and not necessarily in the clinic or the school or the community mental health center or in the home of the client that I was, once anticipating. And so dealing with the loss of that, but then from that, creating particular training goals. And if your supervisor doesn't do a supervision contract, really being able to have loosely a discussion around what that's going to look like, the supervisor or supervisee experience, how that is going to look, what your predictable schedule, as much as you can create and craft for yourself, what a predictable schedule is going to look like, particularly as it relates to your training schedule. Supervisors are dealing with a lot as well. And so really trying to hone in on how your supervisor can support you and be available to you in given that you're not in the same location with one another. And so supervisor contracts or just discussions around how we're going to maneuver or navigate through this year are very helpful, in addition to developing predictable schedules. Considering if you are going to spend time in supervision through a telephone call versus Zoom, is this your opportunity to take a break from a Zoom meeting to combat Zoom fatigue, and perhaps you spend time over the telephone with your supervisor and or in person if that opportunity presents itself. And so kind of considering what is the best supervision model that's going to work for you and your supervisor for your training experience. Also really being able to identify what is going to be my self-care plan. And by now, since we have been dealing with this since March, I'm sure you have been able to kind of reflect upon what's working well and what's not necessarily going so well, and probably having to make some adjustments to what is going to be sustainable as it relates to self-care plans. Some things that I've heard, some opportunities, as was discussed by Erika, for being creative in dealing with and managing a pandemic is I've heard of intern cohorts still developing their cohort, but having that separate from, as opposed to them all being in the room or on site together, having a group meet where they're checking in with one another, or having a lunch date where they're interacting via Zoom in an effort to create a sense of community and knowing that you're not in this alone. Although this particular experience can help, not can help, but can create a sense of isolation, or I don't have as much support as I had when I was on site and I could pass by somebody's office or see somebody in the cafeteria or lunchroom and be able to just run something by them. So in the absence of that, creating something anew that may look different, but also may serve a healthy purpose. This whole being able to juggle the clinical life of the intern is also, I think, taking into consideration by the training programs what it's like to not only be managing this clinically, but also having to manage academia through a virtual modality as well. And how do you juggle that? So really being able to utilize the supports in seminar classes and the supports of your cohorts at your home-based academic institution. So as I kind of think about the what's within my control, these are some of the ideas and or examples of what I've observed, witnessed to be helpful to interns that are navigating these new waters. One other thing that I think is important is, as we think about the parallel process once again, or drawing parallels, that oftentimes the intern is in the midst of developing and adjusting to and demonstrating resilience, or feelings of being overwhelmed, whatever one's experience is. I do think that it's important to also utilize supervision to be able to talk about what that experience is for me as the clinical trainee, while I'm also holding that particular there may be some similarities to what I'm going through that my client is also experiencing. I know that just practicing with working with children and adolescents, there has been a lot of conversation that I've had with the kids and the teens that I work with around knowing how to join meetings, having to be in front of the screen, feeling overwhelmed with the workload. This looks very different than in March, where there was a lot of independent learning, but now students being asked, children being asked to sit in front of screens. And also parents not necessarily being as available because they have to work remotely as well. So I think that, you know, there's a parallel process there and an opportunity for interns to really be able to utilize the supports that they have so that they can fill their cup, so to speak, and before they're able to kind of pour into and offer support for the children and adolescents that they're seeing. So I want to be respectful of time and make sure that we have an opportunity to transition to our next speaker before we have questions, answers, and reflections. But in sum, really just wanting to acknowledge that we are in very new times and developing new ways of being, and I hope that we can have a fruitful discussion as we near the end of our talk today.
Thank you, Nicole.
Yes.
I just want to make a few comments about what you said, because it just really strikes me, you know, in addition to your comments about parallel process and that, you know, we're all going through this in our own ways. I think that's an really important thing to keep in mind. But, you know, you talked about two positions that that the therapist, whether they're a trainee or whether they're a supervisor or anyone, can be in. One is the reflective position, and the other is the acting position.
Yes.
Where you can take action. So, and they go in that order, right? Usually, hopefully. One reflects and then one can act. And I do think that the other sort of thrust of your comments, I don't know if you meant this exactly, but is sort of toward community building.
Yes.
How do the interns build their own community? Yes. How do you substitute for the community that you don't have if you're not on site? How do you create a community with your child and adolescent patients? How do you help them create their own communities within school with their friends when they're so, when the outside world is so frightening? So I think that that's, you know, that's probably our saving grace, right? That we can come together and work on this together and find creative solutions to act on. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Karen Silberstein. Karen, one second. Karen's going to talk more directly about the, sorry, I'm having trouble with my, she's going to talk more directly about the clinical experience and the clinical context that people are working in. And Karen is coming to us from Northampton, Massachusetts, where she is the director of the Northampton chapter of A Home Within, which is a national nonprofit organization that's devoted to providing pro bono psychotherapy to youth in foster care and alumni of the foster care system. And her focus in her clinical practice is on youth who have experienced foster care, adoption, disabilities, school problems, divorce, and/or trauma. And I'm going to add to Karen's bio and tell you that she works both clinically and at a policy level. So she's also reflecting on her clinical experience and putting it into action in really, I think, very constructive ways. So Karen.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And I have to say, I think this is a tough time to be an intern. So thank you all for being brave and entering this field anyway, because we really need you. And we really need a generation who's being trained in new ways, because I think part of what's going to happen is that things that we learned from this pandemic about telehealth and working will continue. We will not go back 100% to the old normal. Unfortunately, you're the first guinea pigs. And some of us now have 6 months of experience ahead of you in this field of really converting to telehealth. So we have a little bit of knowledge, but you're part of the forefront with us. So I'm going to reflect a lot on the clinical work and how it's the same and how it's different. Because I think there's ways that clinical work is still clinical work, but telehealth introduces some new facets and COVID. And I'd say on top of that, the sense of chaos, inequality, anxiety in our country in general, and how that's all playing in to make it a very uncertain and anxiety-provoking time for people. But therapy is therapy, and how do we get it onto telehealth? Now, I'll just start by saying that in my experience in the last 6 months, that for the majority of my clients, telehealth is working just as well as face-to-face was. There's a few who it doesn't work at all well for, and there's a few who it works better for. And I do have a few adolescents in mind who I'm going to suggest that we continue in this form, even when we could go back to face-to-face, because I think they're just so much more open, in part because of sitting here, the eye-to-eye contact when you have a lot of shame can be quite hard. But they also can tell me the things that they're most shameful about in chat. And that has worked really well for them. But we'll get more to that in the beginning. So what is the same and what is different? Beginnings are beginnings. And in a beginning of a therapeutic relationship, the first mandate is you start where the client is. Now, part of where the client is on the other side of some sort of telehealth. And I don't think we can just forget about that. That is one of the first tasks in starting the relationship, is asking them about their platform. Some of it is a practical. What telehealth platform works for the therapist and child or parent, family? How is it going to work? What are you going to do if internet fails? There's a lot of setting up the therapeutic frame and boundaries, which we do anyway, but we have to do around telehealth. And all of my clients, because I've had the internet go off, either theirs or mine, or just get fuzzy. And so they know that they're going to get a phone call, and then we're going to decide what to do. Or they can call me, or they have to signal me. But it needs to be talked about in advance, because you don't want it just to go dead and to lose them. Their phone might not be near them. This is both the same and different than any therapeutic relationship, in that when the client comes to you in person, there's a certain way that you're setting up the frame and the boundaries of therapy, right? We're going to meet for 45 minutes in a room. When I work with really traumatized kids, or kids who are acting out or have a hard time, I'm setting rules such as, I'm not going to hurt you, and I'm not going to let you hurt me. And because I've had kids who wanted to be provocative and try to break toys, if something breaks by accident, that's fine. If you break it on purpose, I'm going to charge you, right? We set certain rules in the therapy. So we have to also, online, we can't expect that people are just going to know how it's going to work. We're going to meet for a certain amount of time. If you're uncomfortable, you need to do this or that, you need to signal me. You can tell me in chat if it's not working well. We can do it by phone, et cetera, 45 minutes. What do we do? And I've had impulsive kids over telehealth actually disconnect, because they can't keep their hands off the computer. So again, you want to think in advance how you're going to work and what you're going to do. And I need the parents to know that too. So some of the frame is going to be put with parents. If it's a child that or an adolescent that can sit and talk to you, that's great. If it's a child that you're going to attempt play therapy with, which it can be done with some kids, then again, there needs to be a setup. In your therapy room, that boundary, that has already been set up. There's certain toys available, hopefully to elicit different types of information. But you no longer have that you're providing for the client. So that's also a conversation. What toys are going to be available? How is the camera going to be set up so that you can see what the child is doing on the other end? I've had kids doing great play, but they're moving out of the frame all the time so that I can't see it. I've had kids who didn't have the toys that were needed, and that I actually ended up sending it to them, to their parents. I said, listen, I'd like to have a family of dolls with this constellation, and I've sent it to the house. Some parents, if I felt like the parent didn't have the means really to buy them. Oftentimes they do have the right toys, but you want to make sure that they're available near the camera, or that the parent can go and retrieve it. What do you want? Do you want things to draw with? Do you want things to build with? I really like doll and stuffed animal play. So you need to think through what's needed and how to set it up on the other side. Then what's the other part of what makes therapy really work is the therapeutic relationship. And so the same sort of effort, the therapeutic relationship actually works just as well online as off. These other issues actually of how you're going to manage the frame, et cetera, are what's different. But the therapeutic relationship is a therapeutic relationship. And all of the studies show that a good proportion of what makes therapy work is a therapeutic relationship. So when they compare therapists across orientations, and they find that for the most part, as long as you're a pretty good therapist, it doesn't matter which orientation you're working from, what they find again and again is it was the therapeutic relationship that was accounting for a good deal of the change. Not all of it, but you can't even do therapy without the relationship, right? You need to build trust, etc. And that again comes from you being attuned, available, reliable, that you're showing up online when you say you are, that you're showing concern, that you're learning what their concerns are. So that is going to stay the same. But I think that part of where our clients are at and where we're at in this beginning of the therapeutic relationship is that even if they come and say, well, it's a behavior problem or ADHD, we're all in the middle of a pandemic and we're all in the middle of a country that's in turmoil. And if you don't inquire about how that's affecting them as part of your assessment, then you're missing a piece. So we always, and how's school going? How are other things going? These are very, very important in finding out where they are, what they need, and the pieces together. Because when a child has a behavior problem, often there's an underlying emotional problem, right? They're upset about something, they're stressed, they're anxiety. Part of also that every beginning is, how is therapy working? And I think this is something that we need to track from the very beginning. And in the very beginning, it's not that they've taken away some huge therapeutic insight that's going to help and change in the first few sessions, but it is about how comfortable is therapy for you? Is the modality that we're using working? And so before COVID, when I had somebody in the room, at the end of my first session, I always asked, how did this feel for you? What felt the most comfortable, what didn't? And I'm not sure that everybody was always honest the first time they met me. Some were, but I think they appreciate the question, and you're introducing again a way of working in which you're also going to discuss how therapy is working and how it's going to be changed in accordance. That's the same question you ask at the end. How did this work for you? What was it like to be online with me, et cetera, et cetera. Explore it. Part of it, because part of the therapeutic relationship and working with the therapeutic relationship is that you have to give permission for them to give feedback to you about what's working. So start that in the first time, but again, inquire specifically about how is telehealth working for you. For some, it's not going to work well because there's privacy issues. And I think the one advantage that the office has is that you're guaranteed confidentiality and privacy. That sometimes the therapist isn't guaranteed on their side if they're working from home, and there's kids who might be in the background, and the client might not feel they have enough privacy. In which case, that's one of the first issues that you need to work out if they need privacy. If they want to say something that they're afraid and they can't, how can you do therapy without knowing that? The other thing that I think is different is that we are all in, as Nicole said, we're all in this together. So there's a shared trauma right now. The trauma of what's going on in this country and COVID is shared. And they know that you're in this, just as we can use our experiences to inform how we deal with them and how we understand what our clients might be going through, our clients are aware that we're going through the same thing. And there is, and I think that changes therapy. I've done more self-disclosure with my clients since COVID began ever before. I think they need to know you're okay. I think they need to know sometimes how you're handling it. I wouldn't volunteer it unless it comes up and it's asked, but I think there's a need to be a little bit more open and reassuring with clients who might have worries about overwhelming you and wondering if what they can say, whether you have the means to deal with it. Hang on, I want to just consult my look here, my notes here. The other thing that I think has changes is that we're in this extended, we're in a period in which stress is chronic. The stress of the pandemic is chronic. It's been going on for 6 months. It's likely to go on another 6 months, if not more. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there aren't solutions. There are some solutions for coping. I mean, we can help people cope. We can help them think, what is it that you can set as a goal every day that's reasonable? What can you do for your kids? How can you balance? But a lot of what we're going through isn't resolvable right now. And I think there's a need to really remember how important empathy is, how important it is to name what's going on, and how important it is to just help people tolerate feelings. As a society, we have a sense that we can fix things. And therapy is in part about, let's get better, let's move on. But therapy is also about a holding environment and the ability to simply offer support, empathy, humanity, and what that does for each other, and to tolerate feelings that before, and to speak about and tolerate feelings that felt intolerable before. And I work with a lot of kids who their behavior problems are because they can't tolerate the feelings, right? Rather than feel sad or feel angry, they're acting out because it's simply too intolerable to feel the amount of rage and pain. And part of what we're doing is expanding their ability to tolerate feelings. I can't fix the COVID. If somebody's bored or lonely or isolated, I can help them get a little bit less, but I can't take away the full isolation because that's just not a possibility right now. What I can do is help them tolerate them. Feelings aren't going to kill them. They're going to be uncomfortable. How do we hold feelings for our clients and how do they hold them for themselves? And I think it's a different way. Rather than thinking that we can just fix things or that they can fix things, I think sometimes they have to simply be able to tolerate things. So therapy is changing a lot to stress management, toleration of feelings and coping, and making it through, surviving. And this is the same for school. You know, some kids are doing better. Actually, I work with a population of kids whose school was not always working well for them. I've had a couple kids who are doing so much better online, in part because they had sensory overload in school. Their trauma got triggered all the time by the loud noises and too many things coming up at them, and they're really liking online. But I also work with a bunch of kids where it's not working. So how do you make it work for you, and does it have to be perfect? We're not going after perfection here. We're going after what's the best. Our views, life isn't normal. We're creating a new normal. So what is the new normal under this pandemic that we need for ourselves? What can we create that's a new normal? And it means not just a different way of doing schooling, but maybe letting go of some aspects of schooling, maybe letting go of some aspects of therapy. So I think this is a chance for us to reimagine what our goals are for ourselves, for our clients, what's really important, and what this new normal is going to be, because the old normal wasn't necessarily working 100% for everybody. I just want to go back a little bit to say, I said a little bit about who it was working for. It's not always working for kids who are really too impulsive. And then the conversation really has to be with the parents about that and what they want to do. And there's always a determination of whether and what kind of therapy works for what kind of client. I had one kid who just, as soon as he was on the computer, he was surfing the internet. He was playing with the camera. It simply wasn't working. And I switched to complete parent guidance. He couldn't sit still. He couldn't concentrate. I have others who are that sometimes are answering email. I can see, you can tell by the way their eyes move if they're looking at other things on the screen, where I've decided to let it go or to note it. I think that everything that the client does on the other side has therapeutic value. The question is, do you set a limit and say, don't do that, or whether you bring it into the therapy? So I just note that they're doing that. I see how it's affecting our conversations. There are some kids who it actually works better with, they're not doing much. They're just glancing at things. There's others that it's incredibly distracting. But then I'm getting a window into how they could go through life, right? And the distractions that they have and how they cope with them. And that becomes part of our therapy. So just like when you'd have somebody in the room who might all of a sudden disassociate or look away, I think look for those nonverbal cues and what they're doing online. And again, we can bring that in. This is about you learning about them learning about themselves, what that means for how they are in the world, and what that means for them resolving what they've come to you to resolve. My last comment is simply going to be to address something that Nicole was talking to you about how do interns get the supports that they want. And while she was speaking, I was thinking that one of the big losses that interns have are the informal supports. Probably your formal supports are still there. that you still have meetings with your supervisors and you probably have some meetings with other interns, but you've lost the ability to see that somebody's door is open and they're free and just to pop in, or that another intern is downstairs eating lunch, or that somebody brought snacks to the office for everybody to share and you feel really taken care of that day. And I think the informal supports might be the biggest loss. And I just wonder if there's a way to get that back, and even to set up drop-in hours online where people, or to have supervisors have times that they could be available. I know in my organization at Home Within, we used to do get-togethers with food, and we decided to send everybody snack packs. We had an online meeting and we sent everybody snack packs to replicate that. It's just, are there gestures that can be made here and there to replicate those informal, nurturing, so important contacts that are so important to feel taken care of, not just connected, but taken care of and held, and that somebody is available when you need them, not just during the formal hours, but in the informal times when you need them. So I'm happy to go into more detail with anything, but that's going to be my overview.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. We do have a couple of questions, but before we get to them, notice that both Nicole and Karen have talked about new ways of doing things, the old normal, the new normal. Karen made the comment that, we're never going to go back to the way it was. And I think that that's actually quite right. Zoom technology is going to transform a lot of things. To what extent, I think we simply don't know yet. And, it's going to be a challenge, I think, for the field, because we're a field that depends on relationship. And, the Psychotherapy Action Network is about relationships of depth, insight, and, or psychotherapies of depth, insight, and relationship. And the possibilities, I mean, notice that Karen ended on this note of how do you find a community that you can be a part of and feel together with? And I think that we're going to have to figure out how to do those things as we're going forward. And there's some small possibilities opening up, but we'll have to see. I don't know if Nicole or Karen wants to make a comment to each other about anything, or should we move to some of the questions that we have? Anything Nicole or Karen wants to? Okay, let me move to, we have a couple of really interesting questions here. One of them, this is directed to Karen because she's been talking about clinical work, but I suspect Nicole also can speak to this. How do children's developmental levels affect the child's ability to work in teletherapy? And how young for being alone in the room and using the computer do you go? And how do you involve the parents similarly or differently online?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. A lot of different foci. So first of all, I would say that even when I'm not working online, I rarely see young children alone without a parent. So if a child is 5 or younger, and even actually, as long as I can have a parent in the room, I'd rather do it that way. I'd rather do parent-child therapy than see a child alone in general until they're an adolescent and they need to separate. Now that, again, is going to depend on a lot of factors. I need the parent to be appropriate when they're in the room. And there are some parents who are going to interfere with the child being able to disclose certain things. So then I don't want the parent in the room. But if I can engage the parent therapeutically in understanding what is going on with the child, and then they can take that home. Therapy is 1 hour a week, maybe 2 hours a week, depending on how much you're doing it, sometimes every other week. It's much more powerful for me to help the parent understand the child and to take that knowledge home than for me to do the change. Changing a child on their own is going to take longer than helping a parent understand a child and be able to do a different interaction at home. So if I can interpret what's happening with the child to the parent, and we can talk about what that means for at home and what can change how the parent parents, that's the most powerful. So I would rarely anyway have a child alone if they were very young. And certainly, here you're going to have a very hard time having a young child under 5, I'd say, alone in front of a camera. They're not going to stay in front of the camera. They're not going to be able to manage it very well. So you do need to, a lot of the conversation at first is with the parent about how you're going to structure it and how it's going to work. There are a few kids who are very high functioning who could. Now I never know developmentally who can handle this or who cannot, because developmental age doesn't really tell you a lot. I mean, developmental age tells you a lot, but chronological age doesn't, right? A lot of kids who are chronologically older are developmentally younger. I am currently working with a 3.5-year-old online. And when I was first asked to take on this case, I said, you know, this is teletherapy. I don't know if this is going to work. And she's been amazing. I got my dolls, she got my dolls. She played out everything she needed to play. And this is the child, I see the second question is sending toys. This is one of the children that I did send toys to, a foster child. And I didn't do it the first session. I did it after a few sessions when I'd gotten to know her. And I felt that she needed toys that represented her families and could better represent her experience. So there were no male dolls at home, and I needed to get information. She was doing such a good job of doing mother-child relationships, but 1, the family didn't have any dolls of color, and 2, the family didn't have any male dolls. And I felt that she needed those to really show her experience. So I volunteered that I would send them to the family. I did. And that's when I started seeing and hearing about her father, that she needed that cue. So I think you wait until you see what's needed, and then you talk to the parent about how to get it into the therapy.
Nicole, do you want to add anything to this?
Yes, similarly to what Karen was talking about, I also work with children from birth to 5, 6 years old with the parent exclusively. So I'm not seeing very small children individually when I'm in the office. And so in that regard, as it relates to Zoom, the parent is always present to be able to be present and also facilitate therapy with the little one. The challenge associated with that, I think that there has been a shift in how present my parents are when we're working virtually, that if the child is very engaged and we're very engaged, oftentimes I've been noticing, and this speaks to the therapeutic frame you were talking about earlier, Karen, oftentimes I'm noticing that the parent may be, depending on our appointment time, the parent may be running off to do something else, whether it's tend to another child in the house, whether it's they were in the middle of preparing for dinner or having some other task that needed to be completed. And so I have had some challenges with having the parent kind of scoot off screen. And so I do think I've been having a little bit more individual therapy with very young ones that I hadn't necessarily anticipated when moving into a Zoom format. But I think just summarizing the question in general, for me, I think the particular factors that I'm looking at as it relates to conducting telehealth is, you know, what is online, particularly, what is the age of the child and how they can navigate the telehealth environment? What is their clinical presentation? Because I could have a much older child, and I do have some teens that I work with that I also still need the parent involvement because of just how depressed they may be or how overwhelmed they may be with the telehealth format, even when we turn the screen off and use the chat box, or, you know, they freeze up during a particular session. Sometimes I do need to have the parent available to be able to check in with us if we were meeting individually and things got stuck. So I'm learning Some of it is trial and seeing what works individually for each client. So the factors that I look at are age, clinical presentation, and the relationship, the quality of the relationship that the child or teen has with their caregiver. I know that Karen talked about, what type of support the caregiver is to the child when they're in the treatment room. And often I'm finding that when it's more of a conflictual relationship or there's some issues around the attachment, it has been more difficult to navigate relationship-oriented approaches online than if we were in the office, just in terms of some of the interventions. And so, I have done a lot more individual therapy, I would say, virtually.
I was going to bring in another facet of teletherapy to think about, and that is the ending of sessions. So the beginning and the ending of sessions are actually much more abrupt in teletherapy than they are in the office.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In the office, there's a transitional period for them in which they're coming to your office. Maybe they're sitting in the waiting room, maybe not, but they have an act in which they're actively preparing for therapy and getting ready for it just by the steps they have to take to get there. And when you enter online, they might have just been doing something else a second before talking. They might have been having to interrupt something that they didn't want to interrupt. Now that can happen when a kid's leaving home to come to therapy too, but that's far gone by the time they get to your office, right? And then again at the end, you simply say goodbye and you turn it off. Whereas there's this sense you get up, you walk to the door, there's a little bit of an assessment at the end about how is the client handling what happened, right? You get a few minutes to see, was this a lot for them? How are they transitioning out? You have a transition ritual. So I think it's important to think about that also. And especially the ending. I think the beginning, if you notice that something's awry, you can say, what's up? What were you just doing? How did you feel about having to stop that and start this and blah, blah. But I think at the endings are tough. And endings are tough, especially for clients. And again, I work with foster kids who've had a lot of losses. I have kids who they get to turn it off. They get to end the meeting and push the button. When now, obviously, they can't drag it on too long, but I want to cede some control to them. I want to make sure, and I do this anyway, in a normal session, if it's been a very, very intense session and very emotional, I take a few minutes before to check out how they're doing and how they feel and if they feel ready. But I want to take a little bit of extra time because I can pause at the end of a normal session and watch them leave. And if they seem shaky, say, are you sure? Do you need something? What are you going to do? But I want to talk to them more and really make sure that I'm ending at a good spot and not just leaving them. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
There's a few people who have their screens and I get to see you not, which is nice.
Yeah. I think Karen's also talking about the way in which the old rituals of beginning and ending don't necessarily hold in teletherapy, and the question of how we're going to develop new rituals and new ways of beginning and ending is still an open question. And I think that we're all sort of discovering that together. And it's one of the challenges. Things are very different when it's a button that you press. I still think, it may, for this older generation, it may feel a little different than it does for younger generations, especially kids who are much more used to technology. But there is a comment from, I'm sorry, I don't see the first name here, but M. Happ, who mentions the ending of the session and eye contact. Do you want to say something about that? If you'd like to comment, just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think that the beginning of the session and the end of the session really is so important. But like you just said, Dr. Silberstein, the ending is essential. And I don't ever want my clients to feel like I'm exiting first, which can add to their feelings of being alone. So after we say our goodbye and have wrapped up the session, then I stay on, maintaining that eye contact until they feel ready to go. And some of them are off rather quickly to other things, but I'm thinking of one senior client who lives alone, and I have sensed that just that eye contact for a few extra sessions is very important, and maybe more so than all of the words that have been shared in the prior 55 minutes. And I think, my goal is to assure her that I am walking alongside her, even though we are miles apart and we're no longer in the same office as we would have been.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting comment, because I think Karen sort of alluded to this too, that at the end of a session, when the experience is an experience of loss, how is it that you carry the therapist with you, you carry the import of the session with you, and can use it within, keep it within, so that it's useful to you as you proceed. And I think that, that's of course something that builds up in the course of therapy usually, and would be obviously a goal, is that you keep those sort of good objects within you. But these ending rituals can have a big impact on the way that happens.
And I often say at the end, we'll continue next week, because I want to have that continuity emphasized and the ongoing relationship emphasized, rather than just we're leaving each other.
Yeah.
I think also one of the, just reflecting on the endings and how the sessions go in this format, there's been times when it's been overwhelming for kids to stay connected for the duration of the session, and perhaps they run off, or, I had a session 2 weeks ago where we zoomed in and the caregiver was following the child around the house because they were running to different rooms and hiding. And so I think that all sorts of things can happen during these types of during telehealth sessions. But I think, I like what Erika said in the beginning, like these are opportunities. And one thing I want to bring up in my clinical work, I've seen a lot more with having the opportunity to be inside of, because I'm not an in-home therapist, so I have been able to see a lot more being on the computer screen, but looking into and having a bird's eye view, so to speak, of how things are functioning and moving along within the household, and how a child responds in their natural environment. And so it has created lots of opportunity to do interventions and be with clients in different ways, and also see parents reactions or responses, whether it's anxiety or confusion around why are you behaving this way, or you're not participating in the session, you need to sit in front of the screen. And it gives me an opportunity to intervene in different ways. So I wanted to note that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because we are used to sort of using our imaginations and using the information that we get from a child about
right
things, and now you have a very different.
You see it unfolding in the present.
Yeah. Kelly, did you want to comment about your experience with your son?
Yeah.
I'm not sure where.
I can quickly. It was just funny because when I took him to his last therapy session, like on every therapy session, and even though he's a teenager and could drive, I drove him. He would always say, I don't need to go today. I have nothing to talk about. And even on that last session, he said that. And we actually did the first, which I thought was a good thing, the first like part of the session with the two of us, since he was leaving home for the first time. And then I left, and she said, I'll just stay as long as you need. And the kid who said he needed nothing before we got there was on with her for over another hour, even after the initial 40 minutes I was in there. And I really felt like, and she gave him a card to say goodbye. So I think those things really meant something to him.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you see how therapists are sort of adapting to an unusual situation.
Yes.
Lydia, do you want to share your comment with people rather than have me read it?
Sure. Let me open the chat. Sorry. So I found in switching to working on video, it was trial by fire in a way, and trial and error. But I found, I don't know how you all will feel about this, but there's a little bit of a performative aspect of being on video. And maybe it's more about being more conscious, not just in terms of visually what's happening, but also the lag in verbal communication. Even though it feels synchronous, something is different in terms of there's like a scrim, it feels like. And so in terms of getting up and going to the door, I think, I can't remember who was talking about how when you go to the door, you open it, you bring the person into the actual space. And since you don't have that physical activity occurring over time, which is a ritual and it's not talked about. I don't say, I'm walking to the door now to let you into my office and you're going to sit on the couch now. But I have found that I started narrating. I'm in the room by myself now. Where are you? Oh, you're sitting on your bed now and you're sitting in front of the screen. And now we have to say goodbye, and I actually wave so they can see me, and I draw it out a little bit longer so that we can slow down and be in the ritual and move through the space together. And then the kids are really creative, right? And so they'll start introducing their own rituals, and then it can become a little bit more unspoken in terms of the process. But it's really trial by fire. I mean, I had one kid stick her butt in the video, and so like that's not the kind of ritual I want to do here, but you just don't know what you're going to get. And so, so I've enjoyed working online, but it's really hard too. So yes.
It strikes me that one of the things that I think you're alluding to this a little bit, Lydia, in a different way, but the therapist, the therapist's use of their own imagination in terms of imagining what the child, you're not with me now. I'm imagining that you might be, I have a girl who wasn't a very verbal kid, but she loved to dance or sing or, do acrobatics for me. And what do you do when you're on video and there's not that kind of stage for you in the same way? And so, I started imagining, well, what if we were in the office? You could be singing, whatever. But I think it calls on different parts of ourselves.
Yes.
What we're discovering.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a pull, sometimes it's a push, sometimes it comes more easily. Here's another question. How do you get through the engagement portion, continuing a flow of conversation and feeling like someone is there with you? Great question. Take it away, Karen or Nicole.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the engagement portion, it depends, and I know that's not a great answer, but it does depend. It depends on the situation that is bringing the child adolescent to therapy. I do like to spend time talking with the parent initially about the reasons for the the child coming into therapy and how we'll talk to the child about what my role is, who I am. And I do a bit of an introduction to myself the very first time that I'm meeting with the child and the parent together. And as it relates to the engagement part, I, just get a little bit of a history around how they're doing with this newfound space of the virtual world, how that is for them in their school formats and other formats, and what their preference is with me around, do they want to meet with me with the screen on? Sometimes it happens naturally where the preference is for their screen to be off. I do keep my screen on because I do want them to be able to have the opportunity to connect with me, even though it makes it a little bit more difficult for me to connect when their screen is off. But I do make a reflective comment about, I see the screen's off today. I also use polls in my Zoom sessions. I use the chat box and I use polls. And this is something that I would not have done in the therapeutic space, but I do think it's an extension of me building the relationship through having conversation and discussion through polls. I use bibliotherapy, which is something I hadn't used as much. So these are all ways of me trying to figure out how to stay connected and engaged. But I mostly use the initial phase of building a therapeutic frame. I utilize the relationship that I've built with the parent. And when I do work with the teen, they are often delighted to have their parents exit the room. But I will reflect upon what I've learned about them through their parent, but that, I want to be able to have them have an opportunity for me to understand from their perspective why they feel that they're coming into therapy. So these are kind of some of the starts that I've had that have been successful. I do think I want to just acknowledge before I stop talking, acknowledge that I was working with clients in the office. There's a bulk of clients that I was working with in the office that I made a switch to in telehealth. And I do think that there's a difference. There's been a subtle difference in some of my cases between those that I was working with initially and shifted to telehealth versus those that I have started out from the outset in working with telehealth. And honestly, I was surprised that the ones that I started off straight with telehealth have seemed to not have as much difficulty as the clients that I was already seeing, and we made that shift to telehealth. So I just wanted to kind of offer that a perspective as well.
I want to add a little bit to the engagement portion. And again, I think engagement is typically with teenagers, but if somebody meant younger kids, that's fine too.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there's two different types of teenagers that come into my office. The ones who know how to talk about themselves, and the ones who really have no idea what's going on, and that reflecting on how they're thinking and feeling is a new experience. And so I tend to have to feel people out, and I keep including what's comfortable for them. The first question I ask any teenager that comes in is, are you here because you wanted to be here, or is somebody asking you to come? How do you feel about being here? Because I need to know, and then we go from there, depending on what they answer. But I tend to, for the kids who don't know how to express themselves yet, they need a lot of questions. They need a lot of structure and scaffolding. But again, you also need to be seeing how that works for them. So I ask them, are there things you want to say, or do you want me to ask more questions? How do you feel about these questions? What are we going to do if I ask a question that you don't want to answer? Are you comfortable saying, I don't want to answer that? Are you comfortable telling me to be quiet? We have these conversations about how therapy is going to work, what works for them, what they want me to do. there are some teenagers who you don't need to do this with because they come in with their agenda and they just talk, but the majority of the ones that I work with aren't there because they are bursting to say things, or they even know how to do therapy. So we have to teach them in the beginning how to do it, what it's about, really work hard on forming the relationship,
You know,
empathizing with everything, including their ambivalence about being there. Yeah.
I was going to say that I think that when you commented about working with kids who may not expect people to be helpful to them, I think, you know, we see kids with a range of capacity to trust another person and with a range of expectations that other people will be helpful to them. And, you know, there are kids at one end of the spectrum who dismiss the notion that anybody could be helpful or that they have anything to gain from involving themselves with an adult because their experiences have been so devastating. And then we have kids who've grown up in relatively responsive homes with relatively responsive parents who may also be having difficulties. And I think the engagement becomes a different challenge in those different situations. But I think that what Nicole and Karen are both describing is that each therapist and child creates their own way of working together. And sometimes, you know, a child needs a lot of questions to figure that out. Sometimes they already know how they want to do it, but it's going to be the therapist and child and this whatever medium they're using that creates that way of being together and the kind of relationship that they're working out.
And on top of the modalities that Nicole said, you can use chat, etc. Sharing the screen can work well too. And I've had kids share their favorite online videos, share their music, we can share a screen. We can also, for kids who are, I just helped a kid start to think about jobs. He was very anxious about jobs. I said, let's share a screen. Let's look for what jobs are out here. And I said, you're not applying to anything. I'm going to read job descriptions and we're going to monitor your stress level, because he's somebody who gets incredibly stressed and undone. And we're going to see at what point your stress goes up. This is just a stress thermometer exercise, but it was actually helpful because he started to get interested in jobs. And we could do that more easily through screen share. Let's look at that one. So there's you can be, we learn these tools little by little. There are opportunities.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, there's a question here about using the phone versus using a video platform. Do you want to say something about phones versus, I guess there's more distraction on the phone, maybe?
Well, for kids, you know, a young kid isn't going to be able to do the phone. That's for sure. So we're talking about really people who are much older, and our youth for the most part aren't talking on phones with their friends even. So it's not a modality that I see it working well, and it can certainly work with parents, and I have some older teens who could make it work, and there are some who might want you not to see their affect and their expression. But I do feel like part of therapy is the whole person, and that our being aware of the nonverbal communication, the expressions, the times, what does the silence mean? I can't judge what a silence means on the phone. So I have to work even harder to ask, you know, you got quiet, what happened there? I can't judge if I should just stay quiet. You know, there's times that you see something's going on in their head and you just want to honor that and pause. And there's other times that you feel they're overwhelmed and that you need to intervene to help contain them and work on that. And I just can't judge it as well on the phone. So I would want it to be a pretty well put together person that I didn't have to worry about, and who was old enough to be able to tell me what was going on with them. I guess that's what I would say.
You know, I think that there are some people who feel that the phone is a really intimate way to connect with people. You know, you're really intensely listening to somebody in a way that exactly because of what Karen said, you don't have the other forms of nonverbal communication. So you're listening in a very different kind of way. So I think, you know, some people prefer it, some people don't, some therapists prefer it, some don't. And then there are situations where, you know, kids don't necessarily have access to internet, to computer platforms, to the kind of privacy that a computer needs versus, you know, being able to step outside and talk on the phone. So there are all kinds of contingencies, I think, that come up.
Yeah.
Nicole, do you want to add anything?
I concur with what Karen said. The individuals that I have been doing phone therapy with are actually young adults that I've been seeing for upward of 3 years. And so when we talked about this and transitioning to a Zoom format, for them, I think they were more concerned about their internet access and using their data, and felt that the relationship was secure enough. And we talk weekly. It does feel very intimate. But again, they're in their their early 20s at this point, and we've been working together for a while. Everybody else I have just initiated or we've transitioned to Zoom, but there are varying degrees of comfort that clients have regarding keeping the screen on, particularly some of my more anxious adolescents. And so we do have the goal of being able to turn the screen on, and they do understand that if they're talking about something in the chat, I reflect back, I can't really see what's going on for you right now. So we are working toward we need to be able to stay connected in the way that we were when we saw each other in person, or eventually I'd like to be able to see your face if I've never seen them in person before in therapy.
You know, it's so interesting how people sort of moderate their own levels of comfort with being seen or not seen.
Right.
You know, you can do it literally when you're on Zoom like that, and turn the camera on and off. We have time for one more question if anyone has a final question here. Okay, well then I'm going to thank you all for being an attentive audience. I'd like to let you know that you're going to receive a survey from us in the following this meeting, and any feedback that you have will be very helpful in helping us plan our next seminars, which we're planning to do sort of quarterly as we move forward. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Nicole, for sharing experiences and expertise. And good luck to everyone.
Bye, thank you. Yes, we have to have the ritual.
Here we go.
Okay.